On his first full day in office, President Joe Biden is focused on domestic crises, but soon he's going to have to turn to international challenges and it is a changed world. According to the Pew Research Center, America's reputation around the world has plummeted in the last 4 years. Our standing with our allies has sharply dropped in the last year alone. I'm going to read you some stats. In the UK, we now have only a 41% favorability rating. In France, it's lower at 31%, and Germany lower still. Those are among the US's staunchest allies over time. Some of this has to do with the pandemic. Some of it has to do with President Trump. And the question is, how do we restore those relationships? And what does it mean for other crises that might emerge? To have this conversation, I'm thrilled to be joined by Clarissa Ward, who is award-winning Chief International Correspondent for CNN and author of, I know it comes out backwards, but it's On All Fronts, an exceptional book about her work in journalism and as covering world issues. For more than 15 years, Clarissa has reported from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran. You guys have saw my interview with her before. She has lived all over the world, and I'm thrilled she is able to join us today. Clarissa, I'm bringing you right in. I think she's in London with a view from across the pond. Hi.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I am well. I am grateful for you that you've made the time to talk to us. Are you in London?
I'm in London, yeah, and we're in like tier 5 lockdown here, so I really have nowhere else to be.
So you haven't seen anyone you're not related to in like
Exactly.
weeks.
Exactly.
So fun. So what was the response when you woke up today after our inauguration here? Was it jubilation or skepticism?
You know, it was so interesting. I think I was expecting for there to be a lot of jubilation internationally, like people celebrating, hoots of like, yeah. But actually what you saw more, I think, here in Europe, I'm talking about, was just like relief and this kind of beleaguered sense of like, I don't know how we got through the last 4 years, but we made it somehow. And now I think there's this like grim sense of like the hard work really starts. And I guess some people listening to this might be like, well, wait a second, why do people in Europe like care that much about Donald Trump, right? Because he wasn't the president of their country. But it's really, I mean, you read those stats and they're startling. And I think that makes it clear just how much anxiety so many of America's traditional allies have been feeling over the last 4 years, really having no sense of like, is this the kind of end of America as we know it? Warts and all. By the way, no one's saying America was perfect before, okay? But at least there was a sense that you kind of understood how America behaved and the values it stood for or aspired to. And suddenly all that was thrown out of the window and all the ideals and institutions were rendered obsolete. And so a lot of people in the world, even outside of countries that have strong allegiances, even adversarial countries to the US, were left kind of reeling almost from this sense of not knowing what to do when the center of gravity in the world suddenly decides to bounce.
Right. They could resent the US's superpower status around the globe when we were delivering and we were a steady democracy. But the minute that becomes destabilized, it ends up being destabilizing around the globe, is my sense.
100%.
So the question I have is, what was it, and what needs to change? Was it our response to the pandemic, which led allies to believe we're not as competent or as effective as we once were or present to be? Or was it just Donald Trump himself and the way he proactively alienated allies? Or was it the erosion of democracy that seemed to happen so quickly?
I mean, the thing is, it's like, how long do you have? When you look at the list, I think it started with the so-called Muslim ban, right? The ban on 7 Muslim majority countries. That was a real shock to America's allies around the world, especially America's, you know, some of its Muslim allies. It continued with America withdrawing from the Paris Accords. And particularly that was felt by European allies who really feel like, okay, we're in this together. We have to be working in tandem on this. And then it just never really ended. It was like undermining NATO, disparaging other European leaders, seemingly kind of kowtowing to authoritarians. Who could forget the performance with President Putin in Helsinki? I mean, you know, if you're a European leader, and we're already seeing this huge threat to liberal democracy and the rise of populism, and you're watching that press conference with President Trump and President Putin, I mean, you're just agog, right? Your jaw hits the ground. And it's not just about, oh, you know, this is a president who we don't like because, you know, maybe by some Europeans is perceived as being vulgar or crass or inarticulate or whatever it may be. Because I think Europeans, you know, that's like a personality issue and everybody could just get over that. The fundamental frightening thing for America's allies was the idea that no one any longer really understood what America stood for. And that is scary, even if you're President Putin. Even President Putin, I think, for all the sort of warm relationship and President Trump's refusal to condemn Putin, I think the Russians were sitting there scratching their heads and being like, but what does this guy stand for? What is he about? How do we play into this? How do we respond? The Chinese, the same. It's like, we're going to take a really tough stand on China, but then it's incoherent. It's like one day it's like Xi Jinping is really great, the president, you know, and we're really on, and then the next day it's like we're taking a really, but it lacks a sort of architectural strategy that makes the whole thing coherent. And that's what causes instability, is when no one can really get their head around what is America about anymore.
So some of that changes with the change in leadership. And yesterday, President Biden immediately rejoined the Paris, or announced his intention to rejoin the Paris Accords. Jen Psaki, the incoming White House press secretary, from the podium yesterday said, when asked what foreign leader calls the president will hold, she said, we will prioritize our allies first and then speak to our adversaries. She didn't say the second part, but stark contrast from what President Trump did. So some of that superficial symbolic stuff matters. But what more does the Biden administration need to do?
I mean, there's a lot, right? It's a long road ahead, because some of it is also about what we've seen in America in terms of the chaos, right? The rest of the world is not just frightened or concerned or anxious because, you know, President Trump has been combative and divisive and all the rest of it. They're troubled by the lack of unity that they see in the US. They're troubled by the violence. They're troubled by the chaos. They're troubled by the fact that the US is becoming increasingly isolationist, much more introverted, looking inwards, less engaged with the outside world. So I think, you know, yes, President Biden needs to, you know, do a lot of the things that he's already said he's going to do in order to put people's minds at ease. I think he's going to have some real challenges ahead. Like, how does he navigate the whole Iran issue? It took years to hash out that agreement. And with one fell swoop, it was gone. And now the reality is that things have changed enough and become acrimonious enough that even if President Biden does want to try to restore that, it's going to be very challenging. It's not going to be a straightforward exercise. And so it's almost like, you know, this administration will have to go back to square one on a lot of this stuff. But first and foremost, honestly, I think the rest of the world wants to see from the US a sense that the chaos is just dialed down a little bit, that there is a sort of centrist swath of society that wants to move forward on a path to unity, and that the US will still step up to the plate and continue in its traditional role in the world, even though everyone understands that America has been pulling back from the world, the long goodbye, as some analysts call it, right? And that's been happening before President Trump. That was happening under President Obama too. It's the difference between America sort of pulling back a little bit and not wanting to just be the world's policeman, and a complete lack of engagement, consistency, coherence, chaos. The latter is what really frightens or disturbs people.
A vacuum. So
a vacuum.
You talked a little bit about the challenge with Iran. Can we just talk Russia and then China? What is it that you foresee the Biden administration will have to do with Russia?
So Russia, I'm sure they're going to take a much tougher stance. I mean, let's talk about the opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, who we worked on this big expose with Bellingcat, this investigative outlet. We actually found the FSB, the Russian state security operatives, who put Novichok, a lethal nerve agent, into this guy's underpants.
Would you explain who he is?
So Alexei Navalny is the kind of de facto leader of the opposition in Russia. To the extent that any real opposition is allowed to exist. He wasn't allowed to run for president. He's been in and out of jail on sort of ridiculous trumped up charges. And he's somewhat threatening to the Kremlin because he's young, he's in his early 40s, he's handsome, he's charismatic, he's determined, and he does these really great exposés on corruption in the Russian government and the sort of elites around President Putin, and like flying drones over people's houses. And he puts them out on his YouTube page, and he gets millions and millions and millions of hits. And his message resonates a lot with younger people who are kind of sick to death of the fact that there is so much corruption and cronyism and incompetence at the highest levels of the government. And so at a certain point, around the same time that like protests were really gaining traction in Belarus, which is a small country neighboring Russia, it appears that the Kremlin, or the FSB, I should say, the Russian State Security Services, after following this guy around with this dedicated toxins team who all had expertise in like chemical weapons, they decided that it was time to go for it, right? And so they poisoned him. By a miracle, he lived because he got on the plane to fly back to Moscow. He was on a trip to Siberia. The pilot decided to divert the flight and landed it in after like 10 minutes as opposed to 3.5 hours. That difference, that quick thinking from the pilot saved his life. And when he landed on the tarmac, there were medics there, and they had something called atropine, which is the life-saving antidote, because he knew he had been poisoned. He actually said to the air stewardess, if you can believe it, he said, "I've been poisoned and I'm going to die." And that's when the pilot landed the plane. So then he flew to Germany because he was in a coma, and this was the best place for him to recover. And Angela Merkel came out and said, this is Novichok. Okay, Novichok, just to be clear, is an internationally banned substance, right? And then the OPCW, which is the international body that monitors all chemical weapons, they came out and said it was Novichok. A French lab, a Swedish lab. Let's be clear, it was Novichok. The Russians deny it. The Europeans came out with sanctions. The Europeans called it assassination attempt. Under the Trump administration, the U.S. did very little. They condemned it and they said they were looking into it, but that's all they did, right? And I think that Navalny himself, I know because I interviewed him, felt kind of miffed, honestly, and a little disappointed that the U.S. wouldn't take a stronger stance against, the highest echelons of power in Russia using an illegal, internationally banned lethal nerve agent against the opposition, right? So I think, having said all that we will now see a much tougher tone with Russia, whether it's on issues like Navalny, whether it's on issues like this missile treaty that they'll start renegotiating next month, whether it's on issues like global adventurism that Russia has been so invested in over the last, certainly the last 8-10 years. So, yeah, I think Russia will be a focus point for the administration.
And they'll have to seek some kind of retribution for the hack Russia seems to have perpetrated.
Well, and that's a big one.
And it's unclear how how about China? There's so many issues in the U.S.-China relationship.
Yeah.
What do you foresee the administration prioritizing, and how do they reposition this?
So it's interesting because, Secretary of State Tony Blinken just said that, he was in his confirmation hearings, he said that China is 100% the number one challenge to the U.S., right? In terms of another foreign power, which is basically code for like, this is the big problem. This is the big conundrum. This is the big adversary. And similarly, we saw Trump take a very combative approach to China. Sometimes, although incoherent and inconsistent, and also just relying on a lot of kind of frankly, stuff like calling it the Kung Fu flu or the China virus or whatever, which is not helpful, not productive, and frankly doesn't really have anything to do with the very serious issues that potentially can cause real problems in the U.S.-China relationship. Issues like, there's so many issues involving trade deficit, involving intellectual property protection, involving product dumping. There's a number of really sticky, thorny, complex issues. And the two economies, China and the US, are like this, right? So when you launch a trade war, both sides feel it. No one really wins unless there is potentially an overarching coherent strategy to kind of take you beyond that point. So I think you will continue to see a really tough approach to China. I think, again, it also comes back to this idea of like, who are the US's traditional allies? I think the Biden administration understands, diplomatically speaking, that you're stronger when you act in conjunction or in tandem with your allies, instead of trying to like go out on your own and nobody even really understands what it is that you're doing. So they don't even know how to support you, even if they wanted to.
Turning back to the US, one of the questions when I posted that you're coming on, I got more than any other, was if you look at the insurrection, the coup that happened on Capitol Hill on January 6th, some of our leaders have made parallels to insurgencies we've seen in other countries. Do you see a parallel? And what can you tell us about, I know you've covered Al-Qaeda, ISIS.
Yeah.
There's also parallels to Northern Ireland, how a insurgency emerges and what to be aware of.
Yeah. So I would say there's a few things. Like, I definitely see parallels because I've spent an inordinate amount of time studying radicalization, right? Now, I've been studying that in the construct of Islamic extremism and particularly looking at ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But what you start to realize is that extremism is extremism, and radicalization can happen in any place, honestly, if the temperature is just so. And people who are drawn to extremism, occasionally you get some psychopaths, right? And they're there. In every war I've covered, there's the psychopaths who are just like, sign me up to kill people. But they're not the majority, okay? A lot of the people who get radicalized into joining these movements, whether it's white supremacists or whether it's ISIS, are people who are disillusioned, who feel unheard, who are looking to belong to something, who are looking to have dignity. In the case of ISIS, for example, a lot of the European kids who joined had like criminal records. They were sleeping with prostitutes. They were smoking marijuana. Okay, these were not God-fearing Muslims. They didn't know anything about Islam, but they were looking for some kind of redemption. They were looking to have their life matter and to mean something. And so some people tend to just like glom on to whoever is offering that narrative, that compelling narrative that provides purpose and that provides redemption. And so whenever you're looking at radicalization, in addition to looking at the people who are storming the Capitol or, wherever they may be, whatever the context is, what you really need to be looking at are the people who are kind of fanning the flames of the hatred, are the people who are much more articulate, much more well-educated, who are essentially recruiting, right? Because they're not going to go out there and get their hands dirty, but they are the ones that are kind of pouring fuel on the fire. And so in that sense, I definitely see parallels. And what's always tricky about that, and I remember in the case of ISIS, there was a preacher here in the UK called Anjem Chowdhury, very well known. I interviewed him for 60 Minutes. And the British authorities struggled for years with like, how do we arrest this guy? Because what has he actually done, right? What crime has he actually committed? But meanwhile, he was sending these kids, recruiting them, brainwashing them, filling their heads with nonsense, and they were going off to ISIS and to join ISIS in Syria and Iran. They were dying. And so it can always be much more difficult for authorities to try to zero in on the people, the Svengalis, who are the ones fomenting these movements with their words, with their promises, with these very alluring narratives. And that's a challenge I think law enforcement is always going to face, because these people tend to be smart enough to try to operate within the parameters of the law. Anjem Chowdhury did end up going to prison for a while, but he's out again.
Mm. So what does it take to defeat them?
Well, I mean, this is where a lot of people have different approaches, right? So some people will say it's about having a better counter narrative, right? So don't choose ISIS, like choose, like normal Islam, right?
Right.
Um, that I would say isn't always terribly effective because the way brainwashing works is they become savvy. It's like a cult, okay, and so they come to distrust anything outside of their own viewpoint or their own bubble. Then you have people who say kill them, right? If you're looking at ISIS, be like just eradicate them, just wipe them off the face of the earth, and I remember one counterterrorism guy saying to me, you kill one and five come to his funeral, right? And so you always have to be aware of that. You end up making martyrs out of people. And obviously I'm talking like extreme here. I'm
Right.
using ISIS as example, as opposed to something else. But then more than that, it's like you have to take the threat seriously. And I would just say, I have been talking about what I have perceived from the sidelines and looking at various European movements as a distinct uptick in really unsettling far right white supremacist behavior in Europe and in the US. And I felt like for a long time there was a kind of reluctance to take it seriously. It's like, oh, those guys have always been there, but they're not really dangerous. But yeah, they're not dangerous until they're dangerous,
Mm-hmm.
and anyone in law enforcement will tell you about this, even with any kind of extremism. This is the hard part of their job, the impossible part of their job. You're watching all these extremists. How do you know when someone cracks or when someone decides to do something really, really crazy? And if you don't have very strict rules in place and a really collective, unified response and understanding of like, this is unacceptable, then you're going to see a continuation of the problem. And that's what we saw with ISIS. ISIS was around for like a year and a half before the international community was suddenly like, oh, wait, we need to stop letting people travel to Syria and Iraq and carry out jihad. And oh, wait, we need to take this seriously. And it's only when you close the door and you say no that it becomes much harder. As long as that door is open a crack, the activity will continue.
And you raise a really important point, which is that this is a global trend. Sort of white supremacy has been there. The openness, the comfort in expressing those views, and the ferocity of the growth of this movement is a trend that's not just here in the US, but it's elsewhere.
Oh, yeah. No, I did a big series on the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. And I interviewed the chief rabbi in Poland, who's actually from Brooklyn. He's an amazing guy. And he was like, what's shocking to me is not that like there's still neo-Nazis around or there's still anti-Semitism around. What's shocking to me, because they were always there, but 10 years ago, it was considered indecent to say these things out loud. No one would speak like that. You wouldn't be able to get a job. No one would let you in their house if you talk like that. Okay. Yeah. And we were talking specifically about Germany, Poland, and nowadays it's like, oh yeah, all right, well, on the internet we can all just say anything we want now and there's no repercussions for it, so I guess it's okay. It's not okay. It does have it has an effect. It really profoundly impacts the psyche, even if it's on this very kind of elusive, ephemeral, virtual level.
And now it's empowered. I mean, one of the trends that some counterinsurgency experts have explained to me is that when they start to lose, it diminishes the appeal. So maybe if Donald Trump is out of office, that takes some of the energy away, but you can't, what you're saying, you can't count on that to do it alone.
You know what I would just say as well, I always said with ISIS, I'm like, everyone needs to understand that ISIS is a symptom, okay? It's not the cause. And I think that, as much as, President Trump has clearly been a very divisive figure, it sometimes is instructive to look at him not as a cause, but as a symptom of something as well, right? And let's try to understand what he is symptomatic of. What does that say about us? Because it's really easy to sit there and be like, this person personifies all these things that I don't agree with. And it's much harder as a society to be like, let's all look in the mirror and try to get our heads around, where is this coming from? What is this about? And I do see evidence that people are trying to do it, but it's better to look at yourself rather than constantly demonizing the other, is I guess what I'm saying.
This is a question from the audience I thought was interesting. What is something you wish most Americans understood about the US's standing in the world?
You know what? I mean, I remember being really struck by something that someone said to me years ago when I was in Iraq, and it was during, you know, it was like after the invasion and during the occupation, and like I was having this conversation with an Iraqi, and I realized there was like a lot about Iraqi history that I didn't know, right? And I would like to think that I knew a little bit more than most, but still, I was young, I was 25, and I had never studied Iraq in like history classes or anything. And he just said something to the effect of like, you know, it's so sad. We know so much about your country and you know so little about ours, right? And I have felt that echoed 1,000 times in 1,000 places. The whole world feels like it is constantly dealing with the impact of America in good ways and in bad ways. And it feels that America is a huge part of its life. And I think that it's so, not to sound Pollyanna-ish, but kind of galling and hurtful, honestly, that America very rarely, obviously, pays attention to its impact on the rest of the world, to how it's perceived by the rest of the world, to how it's been perceived historically. And I think that sort of ebbs and flows a little bit at different periods, depending on what the news cycle is like. But I think now is a moment again where the rest of the world is really hoping that the US will engage more again. Although everyone understands why it's been like kind of a busy 4 years.
Hopefully we'll have some time to not just fight fires. Thank you. Are you still on book tour?
I'm not like officially, but you know, now that I can't leave my house,
you can always do it.
I'm always doing Zooms, so.
It's good. The book is fantastic.
Thank you.
People do ask, what is your advice? I always want to ask, what is your advice to people who are getting into the business and want to be an international correspondent?
You know, you got to really want it from like the pit of your belly, and you got to work super hard, but keep an open mind, be curious, ask questions. Try to leave your reservations at the door sometime. We live in a very politically charged, divisive, angry time. And sometimes you really got to shut up and listen. And that's okay. That comes from a position of strength, not of weakness.
That's such a good motto for journalism. Shut up and listen.
Shut up and listen.
I can think of some anchors who could use that advice. Thank you, Clarissa. You're magnificent. I'm really grateful for your time.
Love chatting with you. Bye.
I'll talk to you. Bye-bye.